Detected.
Hey, I'm Retro Rob, and welcome to Coin Detected, where we dive into the history and legacy of 80s video arcade games and the people who built them. Visit coindetected.com to listen to the latest episode. The year is 1980, and today's game is Berzerk. Berzerk is a maze shooter developed by Stern Electronics of Chicago and released in arcades in late 1980. It was designed and programmed by Alan McNeil, who essentially built the game from the ground up himself, art, code, and all. Stern was a pinball company eager to break into video games, and McNeil had just joined in 1979 under the promise that he could create an original game once he finished some technical fixes for them. McNeil drew inspiration from multiple sources. He later recounted that the idea sprang from a vivid dream he had about a black and white maze full of robots, as well as an old basic computer game called Robots, also known as Daleks in the United Kingdom, that involved outmaneuvering pursuing enemies. Even the title Berzerk was lifted from a science fiction series, Fred Saberhagen's Berzerker novels, about killer machines, which fit perfectly for a game about rampaging robots. In short, Alan McNeil wanted to pit a lone player, a humanoid stickman, against an onslaught of robots in a simple but deadly maze. And Stern Electronics, eager for a hit, gave him the green light in 1980 to bring that vision to life. Development was an adventure in itself. Alan McNeil initially prototyped Berzerk with just robots chasing the player on a blank screen. He soon realized it needed more complexity, so he added maze walls for the player to navigate, and importantly, an unstoppable foe to keep the action from stalling. That's where the infamous Evil Otto comes in. Evil Otto is a smiling face that bounces into the screen to hunt the player down if you linger too long. McNeil created Evil Otto as a creative alternative to a typical timer rather than a clock counting down. A relentless happy face would appear to enforce no loitering in the maze. Amusingly, the character's name and demeanor have a bit of inside humor. McNeil named Evil Otto after a real person, Dave Otto, a security manager at his previous job who used to strictly enforce lunch breaks and other rules, sometimes literally locking the doors at lunchtime. McNeil despised the ubiquitous smiley face image of the 70s, especially the phrase, "have a nice day," seeing it as annoyingly fake. So he gave that cheerful face a dark twist, turning it into a malevolent enforcer. In his words, he showed the smiley like it was, "Have a nice day while I beat you to death." And that is exactly Evil Otto's role in the game, a cheery face that ruthlessly bounces after you. It cannot be killed, it goes through walls, and it speeds up over time, so your only option as a player is to run. This design brilliantly keeps the pressure on the player to keep moving from room to room. Berzerk's gameplay is straightforward but intense. You control the humanoid with an 8-direction joystick and a fire button, moving through one room after another, filled with armed robots. Each room is a single-screen maze made of electrified walls. Touch a wall, and your humanoid dies in a jolt. Every room spawns a number of enemy robots, as few as 1 or as many as 11 in later levels, that move around and fire laser bolts in your direction. You can shoot the robots with your laser, but you can't fire and move at the same time, so timing and positioning are critical. The robots aren't the brightest beings. They often shoot each other by accident or even walk into walls and blow themselves up, which can be both a relief and a strategic advantage for the player. If you manage to destroy every robot in a room, you earn bonus points. However, sticking around to hunt every last robot can be risky, because after a short while, Evil Otto will enter, laughing silently at you. When that bouncing smiley face appears, it's usually time to run for an exit located at the edges of the maze unless you want to be crushed by Otto's bounce. Surviving by escaping to the next room is the goal. The rooms just keep coming, randomly generated, potentially up to 64,000 distinct layouts if you could play infinitely. Of course, it gets faster and harder the further you go. The robot enemies increase in number and their shots get quicker. And Evil Otto shows up sooner and moves faster each wave. This ramping difficulty gives Berzerk a very frenetic pace. Players in the arcade often felt their hearts pounding as the tempo increased. It's a pure test of reflexes and risk management. Clear out the robots for points, but know when to cut your losses and dash out before the smiling killer arrives. One of the most remarkable aspects of Berzerk, something utterly jaw-dropping in 1980, is that Berzerk talks to you. Yes, actual voices come out of the machine's speaker. During gameplay, the enemy robots taunt the player with synthesized speech, spouting phrases like, "Intruder alert! Intruder alert! The humanoid must not escape! Destroy the intruder!" And the especially memorable jab, "Chicken! Fight like a robot!" Even in its attract mode, the looping demo when nobody is playing, the game will occasionally blare, "Coin detected in pocket," at anyone walking by. If you were wondering where this podcast got its name, now you know. Imagine being a kid in 1980, strolling past this machine and suddenly hearing a robotic voice accuse you of holding out on it. It definitely got your attention. Berzerk was one of the earliest arcade games to feature speech synthesis, debuting just after a Taito game called Stratovox, which also had voice that year. The way Stern implemented speech in Berzerk was quite ingenious given the technology of the time. A salesman wandered into Stern's office one day selling a new speech chip, one originally intended to help make toys for the visually impaired, and the company decided to give it a shot. This chip used a form of LPC, linear predictive coding synthesis, meaning the designers had to compress and program each word. It was an expensive process, reportedly about $1,000 per word, to have an audio engineering specialist encode the vocabulary for the game. Therefore, McNeil kept the vocabulary limited to around 30 words and phrases that could be mixed and matched in different situations. Despite the cost, the talking feature paid off. The taunting robot voices gave Berzerk a memorable personality and helped draw crowds. Many players from the era vividly recall those distorted robotic phrases to this day. Berzerk's speech was produced by a national semiconductor speech chip. The Votrax-type chips were common then, wired into the game's soundboard. Interestingly, because memory was so precious, the voice lines are very short and clipped, but that somehow makes them sound even more menacing. This was cutting-edge stuff at the time, and along with the distinctive sound effects, it made Berzerk uniquely immersive despite its simple graphics. Speaking of technology, let's talk hardware and clever engineering. Berzerk ran on a custom Stern-designed arcade board. The team originally intended to use a Motorola 6809E microprocessor, but during development, they discovered that particular CPU, which had an external clock, didn't work properly for their needs. In a scramble, they redesigned the board around a Zilog Z80 CPU instead, which turned out to be a reliable choice. The program code and game data had to fit into a very tight space by today's standards, unbelievably small. We're talking on the order of only a few kilobytes of ROM, read-only memory, for the entire game program. One former engineer recalled that the game used about 8 kilobytes of ROM and a similarly tiny amount of RAM for working memory, plus just 512 bytes of battery-backed RAM to save the high score table. That's right, Berzerk was one of the first arcade games ever to include a battery backup to save the top scores, so your glory would persist even if the machine was powered off. This was a novel feature in 1980. Most games lost all scores when you pulled the plug, but Berzerk would proudly keep the top 5 scores intact, immortalizing the best player's initials until someone beat them. Graphically, Berzerk was originally prototyped in black and white, matching McNeil's dream, and early test units even used a monochrome monitor with color overlays, colored gels, on the screen for effect. However, something happened in 1980 that changed Stern's mind about sticking to black and white. Defender happened. Williams Electronics unveiled the full-color Game Defender around the same time, and it was clear that color was the future. So, late in development, literally in the last month or so, Stern's engineers rushed to add a color graphics board to Berzerk. Instead of redesigning everything for full RGB color, they implemented a clever workaround, a color overlay system that mapped simple colors onto the existing monochrome image in blocks. In fact, internally, they jokingly nicknamed this board the BS color system, with BS standing for exactly what you think, because it was a bit of a hack, albeit an effective one. The result was that production Berzerk cabinets shipped with a standard color monitor, and the game displayed basic colors. The walls might be one color, robots, different colors, the player a bright green, etc. If you've ever noticed a weird visual quirk where a robot or the player sprite's color seems to bleed or change when moving close to a wall, that's a side effect of this overlay method. The color mapping was done in blocks of pixels, so occasionally the color tiles would swap oddly when objects overlap. Players in 1980 probably didn't care, they were just happy to see the game in color. Another hardware quirk was Berzerk's original control. It used a custom photo-optical joystick, basically a joystick that used light sensors instead of mechanical switches to detect movement. In theory, this was durable, no switches to wear out, and it allowed 8-direction reading. However, in practice, the optical sticks turned out to be a maintenance headache. In field tests, eager players manhandled the controls so hard that they actually caused the cabinets to tip or the joysticks to break. One reason Stern had to replace the first giant sticks with a shorter, sturdier model from Wico. Even then, the optical design had issues. Internal rubber parts would wear down and gunk up the sensors, causing the joystick to fail. Stern eventually abandoned the optical stick and went with a reliable mechanical joystick in later production. An engineer joked that originally they had tested the joystick to withstand a baseball bat test. If it survived a hit from a bat, they figured it was kid-proof, but real arcade players proved them wrong in the long run. These technical challenges could have sunk the project, but the team at Stern solved them one by one with a mix of ingenuity and all-nighters. They even found a way to use inexpensive surplus memory chips for the video display chips other companies deemed too slow by clever timing that continuously refreshed them so they wouldn't fail. All of this behind-the-scenes effort resulted in a game that was robust, addictive, and technologically impressive for its time. Berzerk made its public debut at the AMOA trade show, Amusement and Music Operators Association Expo, in Chicago around Halloween 1980. There, it was an instant hit with arcade operators. Cashbox magazine reported that crowds were gathering around Stern's booth for a chance to play Berzerk. The game hit arcades shortly after, toward the end of 1980, and it became Stern's first major video game success. Exactly how many Berzerk machines were made has some conflicting reports, but it's safe to say a lot. Contemporary sources in early 1981 noted that Stern had a sizable hit on their hands, with on the order of 15,000 units sold in short order. In reality, production kept going beyond that initial sell-through. According to the lead engineer, they ultimately built somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 Berzerk cabinets to meet demand. One later account even claimed upwards of 50,000 units when all was said and done, counting both the upright cabinets and a few thousand cocktail table versions. No matter which figure you use, this game was a big seller, a runaway hit by Stern's standards. In fact, Berzerk was Stern's best-selling arcade video game ever, and required the company to expand production with a new facility and round-the-clock manufacturing shifts to keep up. It was a case of perfect timing. Berzerk arrived just as the arcade boom was in full swing. It offered something fresh, talking robots and hectic maze action, at a time when gamers were hungry for new thrills beyond just Space Invaders and asteroids. By early 1981, Berzerk machines were sucking down quarters in arcades all over North America, and even internationally. Players loved the challenge and replayability of Berzerk. It wasn't a game you could master in a day. Arcade operators loved it too, because it had strong coin drop for many months. McNeil observed that some contemporary games would be hot for a few weeks, and then players would get bored, but with Berzerk, they always came back for more. It had lasting appeal. Of course, Berzerk's reign at the very top of the arcade charts eventually yielded to an even bigger star of 1980, Pac-Man. Pac-Man hit the United States in late 1980, and by mid-1981, it was a nationwide craze, which inevitably stole some of Berzerk's thunder. Still, Berzerk continued to earn well for operators even as Pac-Man dominated, and it secured its status as a Golden Age classic. Stern capitalized on Berzerk's popularity by licensing the game to home console makers, most notably a deal with Atari in 1982. Atari reportedly paid Stern $4 million for the home rights, which resulted in popular ports of Berzerk the Atari 2600 and in 5200 and others. McNeil later quipped that this was intellectual property capitalism at its finest, noting that Stern took the money even though he personally wasn't fond of how crude the home versions looked compared to the arcade. In any case, the presence of Berzerk on consoles brought the game to an even wider audience of kids who didn't have easy access to arcades. Meanwhile, Stern also tried to follow up with a sequel in arcades, Frenzy, released in 1982, again designed by Alan McNeil. Frenzy ran on basically the same hardware. Stern had surplus Berzerk circuit boards to use up, and it added a few new twists. The maze walls could be shot through. There were different robot designs, including giant ones, and you could even shoot Evil Otto, though it only split him into multiple Ottos. Despite these innovations, Frenzy was a more modest seller, roughly 3,000 units, nowhere near the phenomenon the original was. Still, it's a fun piece of trivia for Berzerk fans, and it provided a bit more depth for hardcore players. Berzerk also earned a bit of a notorious distinction in the early 1980s. It became the first video game linked to the death of a player. In January 1981, a 19-year-old fan named Jeff Daly died of a heart attack shortly after playing Berzerk, and in April 1982, an 18-year-old named Peter Bukowski collapsed and died immediately after posting high scores on a Berzerk machine in Illinois. Both young men had underlying heart conditions, but their sudden deaths following intense Berzerk sessions sparked sensational headlines and arcade urban legends. The second incident, in particular, was reported in local newspapers and later cited by concerned parent groups as a warning about the stress of video games. To be clear, there's no evidence that Berzerk was uniquely lethal. These were tragic flukes, akin to rare instances of people collapsing after strenuous activity. The coroner did note that the stress and adrenaline of the game might have been a trigger in the 1982 case. The story of the Berzerk death became part of gaming lore, adding to the game's mystique. Far from hurting the game's reputation, some would argue this dark notoriety only fueled more curiosity and coin drop among teen players, the old forbidden thrills effect. To this day, if you mention Berzerk to a certain generation of arcade goers, someone will inevitably say, "Isn't that the game that killed a guy?" An unfortunate but true bit of arcade history. On a lighter note, Berzerk firmly embedded itself in pop culture. It was among the select arcade games immortalized in the 1982 hit song Pac-Man Fever. The companion song Goin' Berzerk by Buckner and Garcia on that album is a tribute to the game. Berzerk also influenced game designers. Eugene Jarvis, the creator of Robotron, 2084 and Smash TV, has noted Berzerk's concept of one versus many in a maze of threats was a stepping stone to the frantic twin-stick shooters that came later. In fact, Robotron 2084, 1982, can be seen as Berzerk's spiritual successor, upping the ante with even more enemies and simultaneous two-joystick control, and Jarvis has credited Berzerk as an inspiration. Beyond direct sequels, the legacy of Berzerk lives on through countless homages and references. Modern games that feature killer robots or an indestructible pursuer owe a little something to the formula that Berzerk popularized. And the character of Evil Otto, the deceptively simplistic smiley face of Doom, remains one of the memorable early video game villains. He's even popped up in other media lists of top game bad guys for his sheer relentlessness and the contrast between his happy face and deadly intent. For those who love collecting arcade machines, Berzerk is a coveted piece, but thankfully not an ultra-rare one. Given how many were produced, there are still many original cabinets in the hands of collectors today. The Museum of the Game lists over 200 units owned by members, so it's considered a very common classic. If you find one, odds are it still has the original voice hardware inside. Listening to those grainy robot voices coming from the actual cabinet speakers is pure nostalgia. Collectors also appreciate that Berzerk was ahead of its time technically, which sometimes means a bit of extra maintenance. For instance, the speech chip and voice ROMs can be finicky after 40-plus years, and the original optical joysticks, if still installed, are infamous for needing repairs. Many owners swap in a traditional joystick for reliability. But when fully restored, A Berzerk cabinet is a showpiece of Golden Age arcade tech marquee glowing, the word Berzerk in electric red letters on the panel, and that stick-figure humanoid blasting robots on the CRT screen while Evil Otto's smirking face bounces around. It really takes you back. And importantly, Berzerk is still fun to play. As one retro magazine recently put it, Berzerk, after nearly 40 years, is still enjoyable to play. The core gameplay holds up. The controls are simple and responsive, the action is straightforward, and it's one of those games where you immediately want to hit start again and try to beat your last score. Time has been kind to Berzerk's design. It's proof that gameplay trumps graphics. Even though the graphics are just basic stick figures and simple mazes, the game can still get your adrenaline pumping. When those robots pin you in a corner and Evil Otto is bearing down, the panic feels real. Now, if you're looking to master Berzerk or boost your score, here are a few high-level tips and bits of strategy gleaned from veteran players. First, remember that you get a nice bonus for clearing all robots in a room, so whenever it's safe, try to eliminate every robot before you exit. However, do not be too greedy. If Evil Otto is already on the screen and closing in, it's usually smarter to flee through an exit than to hang around for a couple of extra kills. Survival is key. You start with a handful of lives. Operators could set the machine to give you an extra life at 5,000 or 10,000 points, or not at all, depending on the dip switch settings. Use those lives wisely. Moving diagonally can help you dodge enemy shots the robots fire in 8 directions, just like you do, but they can't all track you perfectly if you keep changing direction. A classic tactic is to lure robots into shooting each other or to trick them into walking into walls. If a room starts with a lot of robots and you're in a bad position, it's sometimes viable to immediately exit through the doorway behind you and skip that room entirely. The next room might be an easier layout. There's even a known pattern some players use by cycling through exits in a loop, often called the box pattern, to control the difficulty, though truly random rooms make it tricky to rely on patterns for long. Importantly, stay on the move. Standing still to aim can be useful. You actually can shoot while standing still by holding the fire button, which lets you rotate without walking, a quirk some players discover, but if you camp too long, you become a sitting duck. As the game speeds up, a good rule is fire a few shots, then reposition. Keep an eye on where Evil Otto spawns. He always enters from the same wall you entered from. A savvy player will try to exit on the opposite side of where Otto appears, so that you maximize the distance between you and the smiling menace. There were actually 2 versions of Berzerk in arcades by 1981. The later Fast Bullets version introduced newer robot colors and much faster projectile speeds. If you play a machine and notice the robots shooting almost instantly, you're on the tougher Fast Bullet ROMs. Many top players consider Fast Bullets the ultimate challenge. In fact, the world record scores are usually tracked in that mode. And speaking of records, the first officially recognized world record on Berzerk was set in 1984 by a gentleman named Ron Bailey, who scored 104,680 points on the Fast Bullets setting. Back in those days, Twin Galaxies and the Guinness Book of World Records ran contests to establish high scores, and Ron's score was published as the Berzerk benchmark in the mid-'80s. Over the years, that record was pushed much higher. For example, by 2005, champion player Chris Era managed 325,270 points in a marathon game of Berzerk, also in Fast Bullets mode. And incredibly, even that was eventually beaten. As of the 2010s, the top players have exceeded 350,000 points on a single run. But for most of us regular folks, breaking even 10,000 points in Berzerk is an achievement to be proud of. It's a tough game. McNeil originally tuned it so hard that his first version only let you live a few seconds. The average game time on one life was about 6 seconds, not good, he admitted. He adjusted the difficulty to give novices around 3 minutes of play on their first quarter, but Berzerk never became an easy game by any stretch. It was designed to be a white-knuckle experience. Looking back, Berzerk holds a special place in arcade history. It wasn't the absolute flashiest or the most lucrative game of its era, We all know Pac-Man and Donkey Kong stole much of the limelight, but it was truly innovative and left a lasting legacy. It proved that speech could elevate a video game's immersion and character. It introduced one of the earliest dynamic villain characters in Evil Otto, a foe that players love to hate. It showed that a game could be simple to learn, yet endlessly challenging to master, which is a big reason people still play it today. Berzerk also cemented Stern Electronics as a player in the arcade world. At least for a few years, Stern would follow up with other hits like Scramble and Tutankhamun, but Berzerk was their crown jewel, and it gave its creator Alan McNeil a sort of cult hero status among classic game developers. Interestingly, McNeil moved on from arcade development a couple years later and ended up contributing to the world of software in a completely different way. He helped create Macromind Director, a multimedia programming tool that was a precursor to Adobe Flash. So, the guy who helped bring talking robots to arcades in 1980 later helped make multimedia software in the 1990s. What a career. In the end, what really matters is that Berzerk is just a blast to play, even 4 decades later. It delivers a pure arcade rush, the nervous excitement of zigzagging through a neon maze, blasting robots, listening to that electronic voice growl, "Kill the intruder" at you, and leaping out of your skin when Evil Otto suddenly bounces in with his wicked grin. If you ever get the chance to play a real Berzerk cabinet, give it a go. You might find yourself surprised at how quickly the old-school addiction sets in. As one modern reviewer said, Berzerk is a rare game that after nearly 40 years is still enjoyable to play. It's incredibly simple but wildly addictive. The game's formula of run, shoot, survive is timeless. And that's the story of Berzerk, a game born from a dream, brought to life by a determined programmer in Chicago, voiced by a robotic chorus of insults, and etched into arcade legend by both its achievements and its odd tragedies. From the first shouted, "Intruder alert," to the last coin dropped in to beat that high score, Berzerk embodies the magic of the golden age of arcades. It's equal parts fun and fury, just like the name implies. And that's it for this episode of Coin Detected. If you have any questions or comments, would like to hear me talk about a game I haven't covered yet, or would like to correct something I said, you can send a message to rob@coindetected.com. This is Retro Rob. This episode is over, but the game never ends. See you at the arcade.
The sequence is complete. Game over.